Chapter 4. Poltergeists. Poltergeist is the term assigned to those apparently meaningless noises and movements of objects from which we from time to time hear accounts. The word is, of course, German and may be translated to boisterous ghost. A poltergeist is seldom or never seen, but contents itself by moving furniture and other objects about in an extraordinary manner, often contrary to the laws of gravitation. Sometimes footsteps are heard, but nothing is visible, while at other times vigorous rappings will be heard either on the walls or floors of a room, and in a manner in which the raps are given, a poltergeist has often showed itself as having a close connection with the physical phenomena of spiritualism. For cases have occurred in which a poltergeist has given the exact number of raps mentally asked for by some person present. Another point that is worthy of note is the fact that the hauntings of a poltergeist are generally attached to a certain individual in a certain spot, and thus differ from the operations of an ordinary ghost. The two following incidents related in this chapter are taken from a paper read by Professor Barrett, F.R.S., before the Society of Psychical Research. In the case of the first anecdote, he made every possible inquiry into the facts set forth, short of actually being an eyewitness of the phenomena. In the case of the second, he made personal investigation and himself saw the whole of the incidents related. There is therefore very little room to doubt the genuineness of either story. Footnote 6. Proceedings. August 1911. In the year 1910, in a certain house in Court Street, Enniscorthy, there lived a laboring man named Redmond. His wife took in boarders to supplement her husband's wages, and at the time to which we refer, there were 3 men boarding with her. The house consisted of 5 rooms, 2 on the ground floor, of which one was a shop and the other the kitchen. The 2 other rooms upstairs were occupied by the Redmonds and their servant, respectively. The bedroom in which the boarders slept was large and contained 2 beds, one at each end of the room, 2 men sleeping in one of them. John Randall and George Sinnott were the names of the 2, but the name of the third lodger is not known. He seems to have left the Redmonds very shortly after the disturbances commenced. It was on July 4th, 1910, that John Randall, who was a carpenter by trade, went to live in Enniscorthy and took rooms with the Redmonds. In his signed statement, now in possession of Professor Barrett, he tells a graphic tale of what occurred each night during the 3 weeks he lodged in the house, and as a result of the poltergeist attentions, he lost 3/4 of his stone in weight. It was on the night of Thursday, July 7th, that the first incident occurred, when the bedclothes were gently pulled off his bed. Of course he naturally thought it was a joke, and shouted to his companions to stop. As no one could explain what was happening, a match was struck, and the bedclothes were found to be at the window, from which the other bed, a large piece of furniture, which ordinarily took 2 people to move, had been rolled just when the clothes had been taken off Randall's bed. Things were put straight and the light blown out, but, Randall's account goes on to say, it wasn't long till we heard some hammering in the room, tap, 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 like. This lasted for a few minutes, getting quicker and quicker. When it got very quick, their beds started to move across the room. We then struck a match and got the lamp. We searched the room thoroughly and could find nobody. Nobody had come in the door. We called the man of the house, Redmond. He came into the room, saw the bed, told us to push it back and get into bed. He thought all the time one of us was playing tricks on the other. I said I wouldn't stay in the other bed by myself, so I got in with the others. We put out the light again, and it had only been a couple of minutes when the bed ran out on the floor with the 3 of us. Richard struck a match again, and this time we all got up and put on our clothes. We had got a terrible fright and couldn't stick it any longer. We told the man of the house we would sit up in the room till daylight. During the time we were sitting in the room, we could hear footsteps leaving the kitchen and coming up the stairs. It would stop at the landing outside the door and wouldn't come into the room. The footsteps and the noises continued through the house until daybreak. The next night the footsteps and noises were continued, but the unfortunate men did not experience any other annoyance. On the following day the men went home, and it is to be hoped they were able to make up for all the sleep they had lost on the 2 previous nights. They returned on Sunday, and from that night till they finally left the house, the men were disturbed practically every night. On Monday, 11th July, the bed was continually running out from the wall with its 3 occupants. They kept the lamp alight, and a chair was seen to dance gaily out into the middle of the floor. On the following Thursday, we read of the same happenings, with the addition that one of the boarders was lifted out of bed, though he felt no hand near him. It seems strange that they should have gone through such a bad night exactly a week from the night the poltergeist started its operations. So the account goes on. Every night that they had slept in a room, the hauntings continued, some nights being worse than others. On Friday, 29th July, the bed turned up on one side and threw us out onto the floor, and before we were thrown out, the pillow was taken from under our head 3 times. When the bed rose up, it fell back without making any noise. This bed was so heavy, it took both the woman and the girl to pull it out from the wall without anybody in it, and there were only 3 casters on it. The poltergeist must have been an insistent fellow, for when the unfortunate men took refuge in the other bed, they had not long been in it before it began to rise, but could not get out of the recess it was in unless it was taken to pieces. It kept very bad, we read, for the next few nights. So Mr. Murphy from the Guardian office and another man named Devereaux came and stopped in the room one night. The experiences of Murphy and Devereaux on this night are contained in a further statement signed by Murphy and corroborated by Devereaux. They seem to have gone to work in a businesslike manner, as before taking their positions for the night, they made a complete investigation of the bedroom and house, so as to eliminate all chance of trickery or fraud. By this time, it should be noted, one of Mrs. Redmond's lodgers had evidently suffered enough from the poltergeist, as only 2 men are mentioned in Murphy's statement, one sleeping in each bed. The 2 investigators took up their positions against the wall midway between the 2 beds, so that they had a full view of the room and the occupants of the bed. The night, says Murphy, was a clear, starlit night. No blind obstructed the view from outside, and one could see the outlines of the beds and their occupants clearly. At about 11:30, a tapping was heard close to the foot of Randall's bed. My companion remarked that it appeared to be like the noise of a rat eating at timber. Sinnott replied, "You'll soon see the rat, it is," and the tapping went on slowly at first. Then the speed gradually increased to about 100 or 120 per minute, the noise growing louder. This continued on for about 5 minutes, when it suddenly stopped. Randall then spoke. He said, "The clothes are slipping off my bed. Look at them sliding off. Good God, they are going off me." Mr. Devereaux immediately struck a match, which he had ready in his hand. The bedclothes had partly left the boy's bed, having gone diagonally towards a foot, going out at the left corner, and not alone did they seem to be drawn off the bed, but they appeared to be actually going back under the bed, much in the same position one would expect bedclothes to be if a strong breeze were blowing through the room at the time. But then everything was perfectly calm. A search was then made for wires or strings, but nothing of the sort could be found. The bedclothes were put back and the light extinguished. For 10 minutes silence reigned, only to be broken by more rapping, which was followed by shouts from Randall. He was told to hold on to the clothes, which were sliding off again, but this was of little use, for he was heard to cry, "I'm going, I'm going, I'm gone," and then a light was struck, and he was seen to slide from the bed, and all the bedclothes with him. Randall, who with Sinnott had shown considerable strength of mind by staying in the house under such trying circumstances, had evidently had enough of ghostly hauntings, for as he lay on the floor, trembling in every limb and bathed with perspiration, he exclaimed, "Oh, isn't this dreadful? I can't stand it. I can't stay here any longer." He was eventually persuaded to get back to bed. Later on, more rapping occurred in a different part of the room, but it soon stopped, and the rest of the night passed away in peace. Randall and Sinnott went to their homes the next day, and Mr. Murphy spent from 11 till long past midnight in their vacated room, but heard and saw nothing unusual. He states in conclusion that Randall could not reach that part of the floor from which the rapping came on any occasion without attracting my attention and that of my comrade. The next case related by Professor Barrett occurred in County Fermanagh at a spot 11 miles from Enniskillen, and about 2 miles from the hamlet of Derrygonnelly, where there dwelt a farmer and his family of 4 girls and a boy, of whom the eldest was a girl of about 20 years of age named Maggie. His cottage consisted of 3 rooms, the kitchen or dwelling room being in the center, with a room on each side used as bedrooms. In one of these 2 rooms Maggie slept with her sisters, and it was here that the disturbances occurred, generally after they had all gone to bed, when rappings and scratchings were heard which often lasted all night. Rats were first blamed, but when things were moved by some unseen agent, and boots and candles thrown out of the house, it was seen that something more than the ordinary rat was at work. The old farmer, who was a Methodist, sought advice from his class leader and by his directions laid an open Bible on the bed in the haunted room, placing a big stone on the book. But the stone was lifted off by an unseen hand. The Bible moved out of the room, and 17 pages torn out of it. They could not keep a lamp or candle in the house, so they went to the neighbors for help. And to quote the old farmer's words to Professor Barrett, Jack Flanagan came and lent us a lamp, saying the devil himself would not steal it, as he had got the priest to sprinkle it with holy water. But that, the old man said, did us no good either, for the next day it took away that lamp also. Professor Barrett, at the invitation of Mr. Thomas Plunkett of Enniskillen, went to investigate. He got a full account from the farmer of the freakish tricks which were continually being played in the house, and gives a graphic account of what he himself observed. After the children, except the boy, had gone to bed, Maggie lay down on a bed without undressing, so that her hands and feet could be observed. The rest of us sat round the kitchen fire, when the faint raps, rapidly increasing in loudness, were heard coming apparently from the walls, the ceiling, and various parts of the inner room, the door of which was open. On entering the bedroom with a light, the noises at first ceased, but recommenced when I put the light on the window-sill in the kitchen. I had the boy and his father by my side, and asked Mr. Plunkett to look round the house outside. Standing in the doorway leading to the bedroom, the noises recommenced, and the light was gradually brought nearer, and after much patience I was able to bring the light into the bedroom, whilst the disturbances were still loudly going on. At last I was able to go up to the side of the bed, with the lighted candle in my hand, and closely observed each of the occupants lying on the bed. The younger children were apparently asleep, and Maggie was motionless. Nevertheless, knocks were going on everywhere around, on the chairs, the bedstead, the walls, and the ceilings. The closest scrutiny failed to detect any movement on the part of those present that could account for the noises, which were accompanied by a scratching or tearing sound. Suddenly, a very large pebble fell in my presence onto the bed. No one had moved to dislodge it, even if it had been placed for the purpose. When I replaced the candle on the window-sill in the kitchen, the knocks became still louder, like those made by a heavy carpenter's hammer driving nails into flooring. A couple of days afterwards, the Reverend Maxwell Close, M.A., a well-known member of the S.P.R., Professor Barrett, and Mr. Plunkett, and together the party of 3, paid visits on 2 consecutive nights to the haunted farmhouse, and the noises were repeated. Complete search was made, both inside and outside of the house, but no cause could be found. When the party was leaving, the old farmer was much perturbed that they had not laid the ghost. When questioned, he said he thought it was fairies. He was asked if he had answered to questions by raps, and he said he had. But it tells lies as often as truth, and oftener, I think. We tried it, and it only knocked at L-M-N when we said the alphabet over. Professor Barrett then tested it by asking mentally for a certain number of raps, and immediately the actual number was heard. He repeated this 4 times with a different number each time, and with the same result. Perhaps the most interesting part of this particular case is at the end of Professor Barrett's account, when, at the request of the old farmer, Mr. Maxwell Close read some passages from Scripture, followed by the Lord's Prayer, to an accompaniment of knocking and scratches, which were at first so loud that the solemn words could hardly be heard, but which gradually ceased as they all knelt in prayer, and since that night no further disturbance occurred. Another similar story comes from the north of Ireland. In the year 1866, as recorded in the Larne Reporter of March 31st in that year, 2 families residing at Upper Ballygowan, near Larne, suffered a series of annoyances from having stones thrown into their houses both by night and by day. Their neighbors came in great numbers to sympathize with them in their affliction, and on one occasion, after a volley of stones had been poured into the house through the window, a young man who was present fired a musket in the direction of the mysterious assailants. The reply was a loud peal of satanic laughter, followed by a volley of stones and turf. On another occasion, a heap of potatoes, which was in an inner apartment of one of the houses, was seen to be in commotion, and shortly afterwards its contents were hurled into the kitchen, where the inmates of the house, with some of their neighbors, were assembled. The explanation given by some people of this mysterious affair was as mysterious as the affair itself. It was said that many years before the occurrences which we have now related took place, the farmer who then occupied the premises in which they happened was greatly annoyed by the mischievous tricks which were played upon him by a company of fairies who had a habit of holding their rendezvous in his house. The consequence was that this man had to leave the house, which for a long time stood a roofless ruin. After the lapse of many years, and when the story about the dilapidated fabric had been haunted had probably been forgotten, the people who then occupied the adjoining lands unfortunately took some of the stones of the old deserted mansion to repair their own buildings. At this the fairies, or good people, were much incensed, and they vented their displeasure on the offender in the way we have described. A correspondent from County Wexford, who desires to have his name suppressed, writes as follows: "Less than 10 miles from the town of Blank, County Wexford, lives a small farmer named M., who by dint of thrift and industry has reared a large family decently and comfortably. Some years ago Mr. M., through the death of a relative, fell in for a legacy of about £100. As he was already in rather prosperous circumstances, and as his old thatched dwelling house was not large enough to accommodate his increasing family, he resolved to spend the money in building a new one. Not long afterward, building operations commenced, and in about a year he had a fine slated cottage, or a small farmhouse, erected and ready for occupation. So far, very well. But it is little our friend M. anticipated the troubles which were still ahead of him. He purchased some new furniture at the nearest town, and on a certain day he removed all the furniture which the old house contained into the new one. And in the evening the family found themselves installed in the latter for good, as they thought. They all retired to rest at their usual hour. Scarcely were they snugly settled in bed when they heard peculiar noises inside the house. As time passed, the din became terrible. There was shuffling of feet, slamming of doors, pulling about of furniture, and so forth. The man of the house got up to explore, but could see nothing, neither was anything disturbed. The door was securely locked as he left it, and after a thorough investigation, in which his wife assisted, he had to own he could find no clue to the cause of the disturbance. The couple went to bed again, and almost immediately the racket recommenced, and continued more or less till dawn. The inmates were puzzled and frightened, but determined to try whether the noise would be repeated the next night before telling their neighbors what had happened. But the pandemonium experienced the first night of their occupation was nothing compared to what they had to endure the second night, and for several succeeding nights. Sleep was impossible, and finally Mr. M. and the family, in terror, abandoned their new home and retook possession of their old one. That is the state of things to this day. The old house has been repaired and is tenanted. The new house, a few perches off, facing the public road, is used as a storehouse. The writer has seen it scores of times, and its story is well known all over the countryside. Mr. M. is disinclined to discuss the matter or to answer questions, but it is said he made several subsequent attempts to occupy the house, but always failed to stand his ground when night came, with its usual rowdy disturbances. It is said that when the building operations were about to begin, a little man of bizarre appearance accosted Mr. M. and exhorted him to build on a different site. Otherwise, the consequences would be unpleasant for him and his. While the local peasantry alleged that the house was built across a fairy pathway between two Raths, and that this was the cause of the trouble, it is quite true that there are two large Raths in the vicinity, and the haunted house is directly in a bee-line between them. For myself, I offer no explanation, but I guarantee the substantial accuracy of what I have stated above. Professor Barrett, in the paper to which we have already referred, draws certain conclusions from the study of the subject. One of the chief of these is that the widespread belief in fairies, pixies, gnomes, brownies, etc., probably rests on the varied manifestations of poltergeists. The popular explanation of the above story bears out this conclusion, and it is further emphasized by the following, which comes from Port Tarlington. A man near that town saved £500 and determined to build a house with the money. He fixed on a certain spot and began to build, very much against the advice of his friends, who said it was on a fairy path and would bring him ill luck. Soon the house was finished and the owner moved in, but the very first night his troubles began, for some unseen hand threw the furniture about and broke it, while the man himself was injured. Being unwilling to lose the value of his money, he tried to make the best of things. But night after night the disturbances continued, and life in the house was impossible. The owner chose the better part of valor and left. No tenant has been found since, and the house stands empty, a silent testimony to the power of the poltergeist. Poltergeistic phenomena, from their very nature, lend themselves to spurious reproduction and imitation, as witness the famous case of Cock Lane and many other similar stories. At least one well-known case occurred in Ireland, and is interesting as showing that where fraud is at work, close investigation will discover it. It is related that an old Royal Irish constabulary pensioner who obtained a post as emergency man during the land troubles and who in 1892 was in charge of an evicted farm in the Passage East district was continually being disturbed by furniture and crockery being thrown about in a mysterious manner. Reports were brought to the police and they investigated the matter, but nothing was heard or seen beyond knocking on an inside wall of a bedroom in which one of the sons was sleeping. This knocking ceased when the police were in the bedroom, and no search was made in the boy's bed to see if he had a stick. The police therefore could find no explanation. The noises continued night after night, and eventually the family left and went to live in Waterford. A great furor was raised when it was learnt that the hauntings had followed them, and again investigation was made, but it seemed to have been more careful this time. An eye was kept on the movements of the young son, and at least 2 independent witnesses saw him throwing things about, fire irons and jam pots, when he thought his father was not looking. It seemed to have been a plot between mother and son, owing to the former's dislike of her husband's occupation, which entailed great unpopularity and considerable personal risk. Feeling for her own and her family's safety, the wife conceived of this plan to force her husband to give up his post. Her efforts were successful, as the man soon resigned his position and went to live elsewhere. End of chapter 4.